Hello, everybody, and welcome for another round of World Talks here on TVP World. My name is Don Arlett. Now, NATO defense ministers met in Brussels on Thursday and Friday in an expanded format to include, for the first time, partners such as Australia, Japan, New Zealand, and South Korea, as well as the European Union. Ukraine was high on the agenda, although President Zelensky's victory plan was met with somewhat of a cold shoulder there in Brussels. Besides Ukraine, ministers discussed joint efforts to boost cyber defenses, defense production and innovation, counter disinformation, and harness new technologies, including artificial intelligence. And now joining me to discuss this meeting is Andrew Dianeri from the Eurasia Center at the Atlantic Council. Hello, and thank you very much for joining me on World Talks.
Good to be with you.
Yes, now looking at this, we see this new format with these partners such as Australia, Japan, New Zealand, and South Korea, as well as the European Union included in this meeting. But we also hear reports from Ukraine how North Korea may be involved in the fighting, potentially, of those soldiers being trained on Russian soil. We also hear the reports about new sanctions against China due to joint drone production. So two companies sanctioned by the State Department as well as one individual in Russia. Is this a coincidence that we have the Asian partners here at this meeting this time around based on these developments?
Well, it certainly is quite a global picture, especially when, we talk about Russia's war against Ukraine, and now it's not only Russia's war. You have North Korea sending rockets, ammunition, and men. You have Iran sending rockets and drones and possibly artillery as well. And you have China at a minimum sending dual-use equipment and possibly also military-grade equipment to Russia to fight against Ukraine. And so I think this new format of NATO joining with its Indo-Pacific partners makes a ton of sense, because the axis of adversaries really that's facing not only Ukraine but also the West and our interests is global, and many of these are coming from the Indo-Pacific via Europe or other channels, and they're being deployed in Ukraine to our detriment and of course to the Ukrainians. So I think it was a good sign to see Australia, Japan, and South Korea also involved at the NATO defense ministers meeting this week, and also, of course, having a meeting of the NATO-Ukraine Council.
Right, and the NATO-Ukraine Council, some somewhat lofty words, but at the same time, somewhat of a cold shoulder as far as the invitation for Ukraine to join NATO, as well as this deterrence that Ukraine would like to implement on its territory. Why the cold shoulder?
I'm not sure I would go so far as to say it was a cold shoulder. I mean, President Zelenskyy, of course, joined this meeting, which is atypical of a defense council meeting. But of course, he did so to present his victory plan. But he was presenting the plan to other defense ministers, none of which are empowered to approve, allowing Ukraine into NATO. That's a head of state decision that needs to be made. So I think the reaction, the response, maybe is just indicative of who was in the room and just the nature of what the meeting itself was. If we had heads of state in the meeting, there might have been a different, more enthusiastic response. Notably, the Lithuanian defense minister did say he thinks that Ukraine should get an offer for NATO membership immediately, and made the crucial point that offering Ukraine membership in NATO does not immediately place Ukraine into NATO, which is, I think, a misconception in some circles, that it's still a process, as we saw with Sweden and with Finland most recently. So again, an invitation to NATO is much different from actually a seeding into NATO, and the invitation itself certainly would be a good move for Ukraine and very likely for the alliance as well.
Do you think this indicates somewhat of a desperate situation in Ukraine? Maybe not desperate, but definitely a precarious situation that Ukraine is currently in. That Ukraine is very insistent that that's at the top of their victory plan to have an invitation to NATO.
It's certainly precarious. That's definitely true. I mean, we see Russian forces very slowly and at a high cost advancing, but they are advancing in the east. Ukraine's energy generation has been cut by 70%, 80% by some counts. And so this winter, I think, will be quite difficult for Ukraine. And then, of course, there's the political issues of all sorts of political actors calling for a settlement, for a so-called ceasefire or negotiations. And so I think actually the timing is good for Zelensky to release this victory plan and to have NATO membership at the top of the list there, because if we are to talk seriously about a prospective ceasefire or negotiated settlement, Ukraine is going to need security guarantees to ensure that Putin doesn't just wait a couple months or a year and go again with reconstituted forces, that Ukraine does need credible security guarantees. And what's more credible than membership in NATO?
At a press conference, President Zelensky said if an invitation to NATO was not on the table, Ukraine may consider proliferating nuclear weapons. What are your thoughts on that? Is this a possibility? And is this something that the Western leaders should think about?
Well, it's an interesting rhetorical move. I don't think Ukraine has the means or the capabilities really to seriously go after making nuclear weapons on their own if they didn't get NATO membership. But I do think it underlines the point that Ukraine, again, in the event of a settlement, is going to need some kind of credible deterrent or security guarantee. NATO being the gold standard, of course, and many NATO countries, or a few certainly, have nuclear weapons, which has been, of course, a key element of deterrence of the alliance as a whole. And actually, the point here is interesting because Poland, not too long ago, made noises itself about looking at restarting or starting a nuclear program itself if Russia were allowed to win in Ukraine. And so Ukraine isn't the only country, I think, that's kind of trying to play cards to increase NATO's deterrent capabilities so that we don't get nuclear proliferation and further enrichment of nuclear weapons, which I don't think anyone wants to see in Europe.
If the United States, also when Poland was talking about this, if the United States has to focus in the East and Europe still has to shore up its own security here in its own neighborhood, is there a risk of further nuclear proliferation, at least in this part of the world, do you think?
Well, I certainly hope not. And I think that the best form of nuclear non-proliferation is to increase deterrence, as you say, particularly in NATO's east, in Europe's east. And that's not only American defense and investing in our capabilities here at home and working with allies and partners, with partners like Poland and on the eastern flank, and of course in Ukraine. But that's also Europe doing its part as well to invest in their own security. Poland, of course, is one of NATO's leaders in defense spending, but there's many countries in Western Europe who can do more, and there's more ways that European defense companies can collaborate with each other to build out the sorts of industrial plants and capabilities and supply chains that are necessary for defense. We heard the former head of the European Central Bank, Mario Draghi's report just a couple months ago that Europe needs to invest in innovation in its own industry if it's going to be economically viable. And so I think defense industry is certainly helpful, not only for that goal, but also for this key elements of deterrence and hopefully deterrence without nuclear proliferation.
And speaking of deterrence, one of the points in the victory plan from President Zelensky was comprehensive non-nuclear strategic deterrence package, something that he was looking to get. In plain English, for our viewers, what exactly do you think this means? I understand that part of these protocols are secret, but if you could try and break this down for us.
Sure. I mean, pretty simple. It's getting everything that the U.S., Germany, and other folks in Europe have said no to. It's letting Ukraine strike Russian military bases and military materiel with longer range U.S. ATACMS. It's getting more air defense from Germany. It's getting Taurus missiles from Germany and being allowed to strike into Russian territory. It's getting even something like Tomahawk missiles, which are truly long-range missiles from the U.S. would be a huge plus. It's getting everything on time. the U.S. has had major delays in getting the materiel that it pledges to Ukraine, which is one of the major problems that Ukraine is having. It's producing more 155 artillery. It's producing more drones, the kind of not super sexy stuff that's necessary for fighting the kind of attritional war that Russia has decided to make this war into, to throw bodies at the line to try to push the Ukrainians back inch by inch. You need tons of volume in order to do that. And so I think what Zelensky's asking for is more volume more quickly, and also for higher end capabilities more quickly to be able to strike deeper behind Russian lines and disrupt some of their own supply lines from deep in Russia to the front lines in occupied Ukraine.
Andrew Dioneri, Eurasia Center at the Atlantic Council, thank you very much for joining us and sharing your thoughts.
Thanks very much.
And that concludes this edition of World Talks. Thank you for joining us, and stay with us for more here on TVP World.